What's going on, guys? Welcome to the episode. Today we're going to be chatting about the ins and outs around allergies. And I wanted to put this podcast episode together because a lot of folks seem to think that allergies are just a chance thing, and they're not. They're regulated by the immune system. And so I'm going to explain how they work and how you can often manage them without the use of over-the-counter drugs like antihistamines, for example. You can think about your immune system like your budget. You've got a certain amount of resources to spend, and once they're all accounted for, if you spend any more than that, you begin to go into debt. So how are these funds allocated? Your lifestyle has a cost, and that cost fluctuates based on your choices. So for example, a poor diet is going to be more expensive than a quality diet. Inadequate movement and exercise is going to cost you more than getting the movement and exercise that your body needs. Lack of sleep is going to drain your immune budget much more quickly than great sleep is. Alcohol and drug intake is another big factor that eats into your budget because there's a very high immune cost to pay in order to buffer or detoxify those drugs. And over-the-counter NSAIDs like Tylenol, ibuprofen even fall into the drug category, as well as things like birth control, antihistamines, which we'll get into soon. Everything has a cost to it, but that cost varies between things. Viruses also eat into your budget. So if we look at COVID-19, for example, worldwide right now, as of this recording, 99.4% of people have mild to no symptoms at all. So fortunately, the vast majority of people's immune systems handle the SARS-CoV-2 virus without much of an issue. But if more folks were in the quote-unquote red when it comes to their immune budget, they might find themselves getting more sick than they would have versus if they had some wiggle room in their budget to work with. This is why folks that have pre-existing conditions fare far worse when it comes to COVID-19. They're working with a smaller budget because the pre-existing condition or conditions are already using up a large portion of their immune resources. And therefore, the next thing, in this case COVID-19, is what pushes them over the edge or into the red in the case of this analogy. Now, this same concept applies to allergies in the sense that if allergy season comes around and you don't have any spare immune resources to buffer the pollen floating around in the air, for example, you're going to experience allergies. On the other hand, if before allergy season comes, you decide to free up some money via more healthful eating, better sleep, etc., you'll most likely have enough room in your immune budget to handle that allergy season much more effectively. But let's get more specific. I'll take you through an example, a personal example actually. This year was the first year that I've experienced allergies in a good while. I used to get them quite harshly when I was younger, but this year they really kicked up for the first time in quite some time. Now, when I looked at my movement patterns, they were dialed. When I looked at my sleep, it was on point too. My alcohol and or drug intake is actually lower than it's ever been in my life, but my nutrition. Over the course of the last 5-ish months or so, I've been including a fair bit more treat foods in my diet than I have in years. Now, I haven't been going crazy because I've been maintaining my body composition for the most part, but everything adds up and no one's budget is unlimited. So as soon as I cut back on my treats, which typically made it into the mix over the weekends, my allergies completely went away. I was clearly hanging out right at the end of my budget over the past 5 or so months, and therefore when the pollen started floating around, it pushed my immune system over the edge, and I didn't have enough spare immune resources to handle allergy season without experiencing allergies. So what this means is, if you're experiencing allergies, in order for your immune system to handle that additional load effectively, you're going to need to cut back on spending somewhere else in order to be able to afford the higher immune cost that comes with this specific time of the year. Now, let's say that you're doing everything right. Your diet is perfect, your movement is on point, your drug and alcohol intake is super low, and you're sleeping like a baby. Then it might be worth getting a little bit more granular in regards to specific food choices, and this is where the concept of histamine comes into play. I'm sure you've heard of anti-histamines. You may even be taking one on the daily right now. Certain foods are higher in histamine than others, and therefore, if you fall into the category of doing everything right, but you're still experiencing allergy-like symptoms, you might want to scale back on high histamine containing foods. And the easiest way to think about high histamine containing foods in general is foods that are fermented for the most part. So some examples are alcohol, smoked meats and deli meats, canned meat and fish, chocolate, tomatoes, avocados, spinach, and cheese, just to name a few. You can easily Google high histamine foods and a whole bunch of lists will pop up for you to reference. Now, other foods that aren't necessarily high in histamine but are just generally not all that well tolerated by a fair number of folks are things like grains, legumes, dairy, nuts, and seeds can be an issue. Corn and soy products are fairly common intolerances. Now, the one exception in the grains category is often white rice. White rice is very well tolerated in general, just as an aside. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to eliminate all these foods. Do not worry. They're just foods to keep an eye on potentially because they often have immunogenic properties, which is just a fancy way of saying that they tend to elicit a more robust immune response than you'd typically want. It's also worth mentioning that this immune budget concept is the exact same when it comes to getting a cold or a flu as well. You eventually run out of rope and hit the end of your immune capabilities, hence you come down with a cold or flu. Now, you might not want to go the quote-unquote natural route by modifying your lifestyle to control your allergies. You might just want to take a drug, and that's obviously totally your call. So if you do decide to go the drug route, here are a few potential things to look out for. One of the most common side effects of antihistamines is drowsiness, and that's because histamine plays a role in alertness, and therefore many of the common antihistamines these days actually contain stimulants in order to combat the drowsiness of dampening the histamine response in the body. That's interesting, right? You're taking a drug, an antihistamine, and then it's accompanied with another drug, a stimulant, caffeine is a stimulant, for example, to manage the side effects from the first drug. There is no free lunch, folks. So a lot of folks are like, man, I feel so much better when I take my antihistamine. And yes, the antihistamine crushes the allergy-like symptoms to a large degree. However, it's also got that stimulant in it, which stimulates you, has you feel highly alert and somewhat euphoric. So that's something to consider as well. So having said that, if you're still going to go the antihistamine route, you may need to scale back on your caffeine intake while doing so, or else you might have trouble sleeping at night just because your stimulant intake is going to increase and you might not have even known it. A client of mine was experiencing pretty intense seasonal allergies and she was taking an antihistamine every day and she was finding that she felt way better when she took it, but it was interrupting her sleep at night. And our immune system essentially regenerates while we sleep. And so taking an antihistamine was great for relieving her symptoms in the short term, but it turned out to be a poor strategy long term because eventually that poor sleep is going to catch up with you and you basically back yourself into a corner. So what we did with her was we identified her food intolerances, and for her it was primarily gluten and dairy containing foods. So we cut those out for the most part and she came off the antihistamine, started sleeping a lot better, and voila, problem solved. A really common thing that I see among clients as well is just hearing from folks in general is that beer specifically tends to really flare up allergy-like symptoms. And like we talked about before, alcohol, especially beer, is very high in histamine. And it also contains gluten, which can be problematic for some folks. So beer specifically is something that you might want to keep an eye on. Now, if you love beer like I do, you may be able to get away with certain beers. So for example, I find that the IPAs really get me, whereas a lager I tolerate better in general. And that's most likely just because the IPAs are boozier, but they're also fermented for longer. That's actually what creates the higher alcohol content, and fermentation tends to kick up the histamine load. One little aside here that I think is worth mentioning: if you plan on having children, there are things that impact the immune system essentially for a lifetime. So for example, being born via C-section unfortunately has been proven to impair children's immune systems. So if you are going to get a C-section, I'd recommend using the swab technique so your baby can get as many of those beneficial microbes as possible that it would have gotten via going through the birth canal. Also, it seems that exposing children to animals, dirt, playing outside, getting muddy, all that good stuff is crucial for a young immune system. So I wouldn't recommend hyper-sanitizing your children or their environment because that can seriously backfire because you essentially make them fragile versus anti-fragile. So take-home points. Think about your immune system like a budget, and I'd recommend always having just a little bit of savings put aside so that if an unexpected expense pops up, you can handle it no problem, which translates to just take good care of yourself. If you do this, you will rarely, if ever, get sick, which is a massive added bonus. Now, if you do decide to go the antihistamine or drug route, just know that there's no free lunch, so be aware of the trade-offs that you're making by leaning towards convenience in this case, which there's nothing wrong with necessarily. It's just a personal choice, right? But there are trade-offs to be made, just like anything. If you're interested in applying for one-on-one nutritional coaching and or workout design with me, you can click the link in the description below or head on over to n1fitness.com/coaching. Follow me up on Instagram at N1Fitness and feel free to friend me on Facebook at Marcus Sadu. And lastly, be sure to hit the subscribe button on whatever platform you're using. Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you found this useful and I will catch you on the next episode. See ya.